Thinking aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is healing and the unconscious. We're going to examine the depths, the extent of the unconscious mind, and the degree to which it influences our physical well-being, our psychological, our spiritual well-being. With me is Dr. Brughmar, a medical doctor who for the past 15 years has been a teacher of beinghood. Dr. Joy is the author of Joy's Way and a new book called Avalanche, Further Awakening into Beinghood. He conducts conferences at the Feather Mountain Conference Center near Prescott, Arizona. Welcome, Brew.
Thank you, Jeffrey. It's nice to be here.
A pleasure to be with you.
Them that was tied up in the conflict and that which was leading to the disease and participating in the disease patterning died, and something else pops in and it doesn't carry that patterning and the disease dissolves.
Well, you mentioned earlier that it's a big mistake to think that our ego can ever control all of this dynamic.
Well, who would want it to? It's so limited in its dimension and its scope and its understanding. I've often said to people that, you could force a development to go in, and I see some material that disturbs me a lot. Lucid dreaming disturbs me, the teaching of lucid dreaming, because it's teaching a way for the ego awareness to go in to control something that is far vaster and far richer and in contact with a far vaster reality than we grok at this level. So it's like, as I say to people, it's like the subatomic quark in the molecule and the cell on the hair of the tail of the dog wagging the dog. And who would want a quark wagging the dog? And that's what the ego is when it goes in.
Yet if you've got an orchestra of characters inside of you,
the ego takes its place. This is the key critical process. This is the key development to the mysteries. This is why the mysteries aren't brought forward until after 35. There's that whole process of I too am important, I too can contribute to the world, I too can make a meaningful stance, I too can save, and so on and so forth. Those are all part of earlier stages of development that have to do with development of me and mine, family, service to the self, which is very important in the staging of a human development. And part of beinghood, this is why I use the term beinghood. It is a staging or an aspect of beinghood, but it isn't its totality. At some point, most of us reach a stage, midlife, where we begin to realize that that doesn't bring us into the fulfillment, that there's something lacking. And this is where we have to pass through. If we're going to enter, let's say, mystical paths or spiritual paths, it may take the form then of the surrender of the ego, at which time one then has to be in relationship to something else. Now, I find it very limiting to talk about in relationship to God or something like that, when indeed there are so many stages before you ever need to evoke such a statement. Interiorly to get to know thyself is an ancient aphorism over the temple at Delphi, and most people who have orthodox physicians say, yes, they ought to get to know themselves, not realizing, of course, that they don't know themselves very well either. To know thyself is a profound, profound path. And much of what we're talking about is not going in to look at somebody else's material, but what is the journey? What are the struggles? What are the dangers of going into the unconscious? It's been stated the journey into the unconscious is more dangerous than stripping down naked and walking through the Amazonian jungle. Well, it is. It's just potentially overwhelming, and unless there is some way to handle the entry, through either centering, or perhaps there's an intent to look at only a part of the unconscious, such as disease. One can really be overwhelmed and collapse the ego structure, and then we have insanity.
Well, I guess there's a sense in which this needs to be done in stages. It needs to be done carefully. If we're on a path of growth towards beinghood, in this sense, we want to be confronting ourselves, looking at our what we might think of as the demonic side, the dark side, the shadow, but never perhaps more than we can handle at any given time.
Well, you see, this gets us back to multiple dimensions and multiple entities inside. It depends on which one's in charge of the consciousness when you bring forth the disowned material. If the child's in charge of the consciousness, it's terrorized. And I can't tell you how often I have to tell people, if you bring that child out, I'll eat it. Because they lose all capacity to hold their center when they're in a very critical shift in their development. Also, it needs to be understood that, the shadow content of the unconscious, or the unconscious parts of ourself, when we say demonic or we say dark, it really doesn't mean evil. It means that which we do not identify as self. So I just recently had a woman whose shadow side was Jesus. And she had spent a lifetime fighting and doing battle against Jesus. And she had a dream that totally transformed this for her, so that she went in and suddenly greeted, she kissed the very thing that she had rejected all of her life, and suddenly found a total transformative experience. Well, that's an example of somebody going into a disowned material that most other people, certainly within our country, would think, why would that be disowned or demonic? And yet you must use the same label. That was demonic to her, you see, relative to her psyche. So it has nothing to do with what the absolute values are of these things. It has to do with relative values, you see.
Let me jump back. A moment ago you said that if somebody you were working with, if they brought their child up, you said you would eat them. What did you mean by that?
I mean, I eat children. I mean, if they bring it out, they won't survive very long. The child cannot come out. In other words, it's why in the mystery trainings the children are never brought into the temple. They're never brought into certain arenas. The child has a wonderful place. Unfortunately, it's deified in our society until you wonder whether or not our society will ever get over being a child, and particularly parent-child material, which is deadly. It's deadly to later stages. It's great in early stages where it really doesn't matter one hoot what you're involved with. But at later stages, it becomes an immense, immense problem. And what I find is that we haven't done the initiations in our culture that closed off these stages. So they're left wide open. And we run back and forth between these various parts of our psyche, not realizing the consequence of regressing under the impact, let's say, of a particularly devastating realization about oneself, something that's very humiliating, let's say, as you probe the deep unconscious and you have to take on the realization, let's say you have a feminine part, a feminine part that is almost diametrically opposite of what you perceive yourself as being. And you have to realize that that is you, it exists in you, it has a place in you, and so on and so forth. Usually what happens is that people become overwhelmed under and they immediately begin the defense, and then they regress to an earlier stage, such as a child. The key is how to hold the development and hold the state of consciousness that can actually entertain the new idea or creative thought, and has resource to engage it and live it and celebrate it and welcome it, rather than say, oh, I don't want to know about that, or ooh, this is what I get in conference where, ooh, that terrorizes me, and you can see the body language change and so on and so forth, rather than realizing that this is a profound process, and what rites and rituals do we have that teach us how to take on these things?
If I can paraphrase what you said, you seem to be suggesting that for any given dilemma, for any given predicament a human being finds themselves in, for any given crisis, perhaps, that there is within this vast unconscious a particular being somewhere in the hierarchy of beings within us which is appropriate to call forth, and that the mystery traditions and some of the esoteric traditions have initiations for calling forth at different stages the quality of beinghood which is appropriate to the individual at that time.
That's well stated. Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what we lack in our culture. And when we didn't close the door, I've often said it's a good thing the vagina closes and we can't get back into it, because people would go clear back into the womb if they could get back into it.
Many times I've wanted to.